did not choose an interest in magic. It chose an interest in me. My experience as a victim of black magic reminded of me of when I could fly and speak with plants and animals without too much difficulty. Of course, we all did this, but as a result of schooling, socialisation, we've developed collective amnesia and lost our confidence to repeat these acts. This book begins with me learning to speak with plants and animals, and to fly again. Slowly and hesitantly at first. After all, we have to abandon so much learning and beliefs. But I can feel this happening, and the change is palpable as I step back into my power. This episode begins in Jakarta, as did my first episode, now some 15 years ago. Indeed, the real events to which my episodes relate began some 6 years ago, accumulating in my wife Maddie losing her mind. Some nearly 5 years ago, also began in Jakarta. Jakarta has changed incredibly in those intervening years, and had most objective measures for the better. A city in which change is imposed with little consideration of how it affects the lives of its residents. Indeed, it almost feels that the more disruptive it is, the more likely it is to happen. Deep down, I know this is not the Jakarta I once dearly loved, now a city consumed by greed and conspicuous consumption. A city in which extreme jealousy drives hatred towards every minority. A city in which I no longer feel welcome. Jakarta is now a city in which photogenic Western influencers are increasingly taking to social media to extol its friendliness, sky bars and luxury malls. Jakarta has the highest proportion of malls of any city in the world, and as a consequence no real shopping streets and few public spaces. Maybe it is thus everywhere, but whenever a new mall or sky bar opens, it has to be the best, most luxurious, and only becomes accessible to the common man after its glitter is tarnished. Also, maybe it's the same everywhere, but simply more apparent in Indonesia. But every development, be it private or public, seems to be based on the lifestyles of the decision makers, rather than those of potential users. Yes, there are a handful of Western influence in the sky bars and luxury malls, but there are no tourists, and increasingly few Westerners living in the city. Perhaps this is no surprise, as Jakarta is a truly ugly city. What else would you expect when policymakers have looked at Los Angeles or Singapore for inspiration and attempted to create this using legacies, administrators as their template? Maybe Jakarta was always like this, but now the impact of this greed and conspicuous consumption seems to permeate everywhere and everything. When I first moved to Jakarta, there was a healthy community of expats, so much so that one could even talk of a community of British expats. The common people living in the kampungs took little notice of the conspicuous consumption of the super rich, and were much more focused on getting by in the local community. Maybe it's a health crisis, maybe social media, but everything now seems so fragile. Everyone seems so angry. Every community is blaming another for its fragility. Again, maybe it's the same the world over, but Jakarta is no longer a city in which anything is possible to one where everything is impossible. At a personal level, the seeming banning of foreigners from the use of the post office has had a massive impact on my life. How can a foreigner be expected to engage in enterprise or invest in Indonesia when they're banned from sending a letter? Indonesia's spirit and confidence in the future has been annihilated, with even its own government abandoning Jakarta and leaving it to sink in the Java Sea. What are those personal events that I speak of? Well, I left an abusive relationship, which in over 20 years in Manchester has destroyed my very essence. But in doing so, I left behind a schizophrenic son, Branwell, who I've loved unconditionally since his birth. I left him with his mother despite him choosing her, turning his love towards me into hatred. I say a son, and that's how I brought him up, but during my dark night of the soul, I was led to believe that he was not actually mine. I also left behind an elderly loving father and a loving mother. But my mother's covert narcissism had meant that we could never express our love for each other. Not that I understood this at the time. I left behind any hope of resurrecting a career or business and either threw away or got what money I could for my assets to begin my new life with Made in Jakarta. Nor did I understand that it would become increasingly difficult, even impossible, to visit the country of my birth and revisit friends and places of my childhood, leaving me only memories. This may sound alarmist, but to those few expats who remained in Jakarta feel the same way. Having lost their jobs as a result of the health crisis, moving back to their countries of origin would be sensible, but currently impossible to do so with their Indonesian families. Western readers may blame Indonesia for this, but I believe these to be global forces which are being felt to a greater or lesser degree the world over. Made had become aware that our neighbours in Jakarta were consumed with jealousy towards us. There's nothing unusual in this. In fact, all Indonesians are taught that Westerners are wealthy beyond imagination, even that they have personally stolen Indonesia's assets and hold them in a Swiss bank account. As children, they are told that someone will emerge from a plane and give them money, a form of cargo cult, if you like. That this should influence public policy in Indonesia's educated middle class is a little bit more difficult to comprehend. This is mixed with the distrust of all minorities, which is fueled to become hatred during every election, never really going back to normal before being whipped up again before the next election. But then I find Indonesians amongst the most envious in the entire world. They don't need foreigners to be envious, only inequality, which Indonesia has in abundance. Maybe this colonial legacy, as much as Indonesia's middle class, seems to have enormous chips on their shoulders, which merges with an infantile nationalism. A nationalism which is based on what they are not, rather than what they are, as is so common when identities are fragile. Like so many countries, Indonesia is a construct of colonialism, which pieced together desperate people across 17,300 islands and speak in over 700 languages by 1,300 ethnic groups. This means that nor is it unusual, and I'm sorry to say it is, that some of this jealousy manifests itself through black magic rituals, designed to part Westerners from their imagined wealth and maybe their lives. It became increasingly apparent that this is exactly what had happened to us. Slowly our concerns became panic, especially as the stress that was induced by our awareness of so many wishing us harm turned into health issues for Made, her youngest daughter Titi, and I. This panic led to Made chasing around Dukans, shaman if you like, and Pa Ustads, Islamic teachers, to rid us of our problems. Little did we know that almost every one of these actually harmed us. And at its least sinister, this was simply using subterfuge to convince us to pay for their services. They could neither perform nor understood. But maybe the most distressing was the poisoning of Made, Titi and I, with lead and lead acetate. You see, lead seems to mimic and exacerbate the effects of the paranormal. Chasing around Java from Duken to Paostad depleted my dwindling money, but also took our eye off a number of important issues, which led to our world seemingly falling apart. Maybe unrelated events such as problems with my banks, releasing my assets, and the death of age from one of our best friends played into our feelings of despair. This accumulated in Maddie losing her mind and our eventual fleeing Jakarta for the protection of the mountains of Gunung Kidul. But maybe the greatest impact of what happened to us was my abandonment of my Western scientific training and increasing submission to Indonesia's paranormal explanations. Indeed, it's only recently that I've begun to resolve these two traditions, and in each episode I attempt to navigate this, often not that successfully. To the Western reader, such paranormal explanations seem naive and primitive, but they are the explanations which most of the world believes, despite Western hegemony's pressure to abandon them. In fact, even in Western countries, many minorities hold some belief in the paranormal. Like non-Western countries, these minorities are labelled in some way backward or downright deviant. But does this not tell us more about the nature of hegemony than the infallibility of the scientific method? Our despair was fueled by the gradual realisation that almost everyone we knew, including those whom we had merely encountered, were in some way causing our problems. But even at the height of our despair, we kept being given messages, even from our adversaries, that we are strong and would ultimately overcome our problems, that our problems would return to their senders and that we would triumph, but that this would take time, and this would only happen when we forgave or even loved our adversaries. Well, now this has happened, although we never expected it to take 5 years to achieve this. With the help of our guru Parkano in Gunung Kidul, we left the past behind. I found a light from God, a light of pure, blissful love, which I know cuts through all darkness. Is it this light which ultimately puts an end to our despair and our problems? Seeing our transformation causes despair amongst our adversaries, and this is how black magic actually returns to the sender, and not through the getting into a paranormal battle. Why am I no longer holding my adversaries in contempt nor frightened of them? Well, I now know that all the jealousy and indeed hatred was based on misunderstanding, based on the misconception that we led perfect lives, simply because we seemed so happy, with no realisation that happiness is a feeling, not a reaction to one's external circumstances. Indeed, the more trinkets one possesses, the less happy one becomes. How can this be? Well, thanks to the internet and social media, there's been an explosion of psychopathic assumptions and narcissism across society. Our problems were a microcosm of what is being repeated across the world over. Of course, all forms of communication, including education, have always done this. They attempt to convince us that it's right to hoard God's abundance and that man needs protecting from himself. But the outpouring of greed and hatred has been greatly fueled by social media. Then social media encourages us to complain about the very bad behaviour that it has encouraged, sanctioned and amplified. That so many people joined in our attempted destruction is not simply that they are narcissists, nor even every group narcissists, but what I've chosen to call avatars, or moral automata as Rudolf Steiner calls them, even meat golem as Thomas Sheridan calls them, soaking in the dominant energy and engaging in actions without really thinking about them. But more than this, Maddie and I are empaths, INFJs on the Myers-Briggs inventory. We really can feel the hatred in the world, and in particular the hatred towards us. Our journey has been one of learning to deal with these feelings, even transmuting them from hatred to love. Now that we know this is our mission. But we approach this in very different ways. I rush into things, as Westerners are prone to do, wanting to emulate Parcono's light work, whereas Maddie knows that simply being kind to all she meets has a profound beneficial effect, not only on those she meets, but also on the world itself. So as you can tell, this book begins with a degree of optimism. I could feel my strength returning to me, and certainly about the world. This involved a merger of the mysticism that I now embraced, thanks to my unpleasant experiences of magic, and my former beliefs as a Western scientist of sorts. Indeed, many respects, I believed that much could be explained by where physics and psychology begin to intersect, something which had partially been explored by the quantum physicists Wolfgang Pauli. And to quote him, what really matters for me is the more active role of the observer in quantum physics. According to quantum physics, the observer has indeed a new relation to the physical event around him, in comparison with a classical observer, who is merely a spectator. Slowly, Indonesia's response to the health issue became more and more authoritarian. I say authoritarian, and those few people in the West, whom I was still in contact with, could not comprehend that what they perceived to be a third world country had more stringent health restrictions than their own. However, as always in Indonesia, as with all legislation, it's not evenly implemented and is interpreted at the local level. Indonesians themselves are quite used to this and accept that they must ignore some rules, simply to go about their daily lives. When they are apprehended by the police, a small gratuity will normally clear up the confusion, and they simply write it off as being that's how policing works, and that they were simply unlucky. But as a minority, I've always been a target for a hard interpretation, and even if the Indonesian way was available to me, the gratuity would not be small. As a Westerner, this increasingly plays on my mind and curtails what I believe I can do. Indeed, as always, when Indonesia becomes authoritarian, it's the minorities who suffer the most. And outside of Bali, I certainly am a minority. In common with the rest of the world, this health issue and the repressive reaction just went on and on. I cannot emphasise the effect this had on my mental well-being. Trapped in a strange country, not knowing if or how this madness would end. Thus my optimism gave way once more to pessimism. And maybe that's exactly what it was designed to do. Coinciding with my developing pessimism was my inability to explain all that was happening in the world, let alone control it. Yes, I was somewhat drawn to what had been labelled conspiracy theories, but these failed to fully convince me. Like so many of these truthers, I knew that something was very wrong, and that the narrative we were being fed was full of holes, seeming to make no logical sense. Like science, variations on the official narrative only seem to strengthen it, whilst variations amongst the truthers lead to disunity and recrimination. Again, was this exactly what they were designed to do? Of course, when Maddie lost her mind, I was forced to become strong again to save her life. I did so by raising my vibrations, forcing myself to be happy. Like now, I also felt so out of control, completely unable to adequately explain what we were experiencing. And like now, it was relentless. And Maddie, as always, was able to cut through my intellectual dilemma. She explained that all that was happening to the world was designed to complicate things. That whilst we were confused, the rich were getting richer and the poor poorer. I knew she was right, but keep getting dragged into the necessary details, who and how, as the restrictions impacted more and more on me personally. I heard 1,000 blended notes, whilst in the grove I sat reclined, in that sweet mood when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind. To her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. Through primrose tufts in the sweet bower, the periwinkle trailed its wreaths, and 'tis my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. The birds around me hopped and played, their thoughts I cannot measure, but at least the motion which they made, it seemed a thrill of pleasure. The budding sprigs spread out their fan to catch the breezy air, and I must think, do all I can, there was a pleasure there. If this belief was heaven sent, if such be nature's holy plan, have I no reason to lament what man has made of man? And that was William Wordsworth. As I say, the restrictions became more and more onerous, impacting more and more on me personally. When they were first introduced, I restricted my own travel, believing at least a part of the official narrative, and it would seem having deeper social consequences than those pushing the official narrative. Yes, compliance would have been difficult, but not impossible. But I believed what we'd been told, and that it was simply a short-term measure, and what was the point of paying for testing, etc., when they'd soon be lifted? This meant not going on our twice-yearly holiday in Bali, nor my annual visit to my mother. It was not so much the difficulty in getting to Bali, nor the UK, but the uncertainty regarding if I could return. Not least as visitors to Indonesia seemed to be getting an abnormally high level of false positives, meaning they had to remain in hotels, often the very organisations that had arranged their tests. A regime of expensive daily tests, then new travel arrangements. Maybe this reflected a risk aversion which seemed to have developed in me as I get older, or simply that I'd already lost my discretionary savings on fighting black magic and generosity towards my schizophrenic son, who'd kept demanding. Indeed, my son demanding money from me almost seemed designed to deplete me of my life savings, as though everything else was. All this was despite the hotels in Bali being at their cheapest ever, and social media being full of videos of celebrities having a wonderful time in Bali, just as UK social media was full of videos of celebrities in Dubai. As the crisis continued, our hotel in Bali went bankrupt, along with a good many others. Flight routes disappeared, so our cheap flight to Bali from Solo, or Surakarta, its official name, was no longer available. International flights were even more affected, and my normal route to the UK no longer existed. Of course, there were more complicated routes, maybe involving multiple legs, but the availability kept changing. This meant that if I booked a return flight from the UK, there was a good chance that the return would be cancelled. But also I'd need to consider the regulations in all the countries I transited through, and the implication of having visited those countries on both UK and Indonesian regulations. Particularly as Indonesia had by then introduced compulsory quarantine and testing, even for residents like me, before returning to their families. This left us effectively stuck on the island of Java, but increasingly even unable to travel within Java. So during the entire 3 years of the crisis, every time we were in Jakarta we became stuck there. Then each time we were in Java and had to visit Jakarta, we were unable to. I was following the restrictions that were published in the Jakarta Post, but often I found that few others were following them. Maybe it was simply that the Jakarta Post were simply publishing the restrictions, but not their rescinding. Or as is so often in the case in Indonesia, laws become impossible to enforce and are eventually simply ignored. Although, as always, as a foreigner, you could bet if the regulations were going to be enforced, I'd be targeted for this enforcement. You might find this selective application of the law hard to believe. Let me assure you, discriminatory interpretation and implementation of the law on ethnic lines is completely normal in Indonesia. You may be aware of the current campaign against overseas visitors in Bali. I know, how does an island dependent on tourism campaign against the hand that feeds it? It's been claimed that foreign renters of motor scooters are failing to follow local regulations and causing accidents. This is true, but equally true for locals. However, only foreigners are being stopped and fined by the police for not wearing crash helmets. Even more concerning is that the only evidence of crash helmets being stolen is from foreigners. Often the very same foreigners whom are later stopped by the police for not wearing a crash helmet. Well, that's the end of my first chapter. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Let me just state that it is only a novel. Any resemblance to real characters is completely unintended.